me a sec. I just need to change my browser. Okay. Samuel, can you hear me? Hey, Thomas, can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Samuel, you're quiet. What's wrong? Just wait for a couple more people. Can you see my screen, Thomas?
Yep. Yeah, it should be good.
Samuel, how you going? Is your mic working today, hopefully?
Yeah, hopefully.
Awesome. This is Thomas.
Nice to meet you, Thomas.
Yep, nice
He's
to
going
meet
to be
you too.
helping out during the term. Very smart person. So if you have any questions, feel free to direct them to either him or myself. I guess Thomas, if he has any questions about chem or phys or anything like that, I definitely think you'd be able to help him out in that respect as well. So he's pretty across everything. So feel free.
Yeah.
But where are these guys? What's up, Flynn? Nice to meet you, bro.
Shush.
We're we'll get started in a sec. There's just 2 more people that are trying to join up. They're having trouble. And this week there's quite a few people who are away because of the long weekend, so they'll just watch the recording, and then they'll probably be in next week. But yeah, we'll kind of go from there. Where Zane? Zane can't join, bro. Bro, how? Zane can't join, bro.
You have to like RSVP to it.
Oh,
and then-
yes, RSVP. Wait, just give me a sec while I work that. Alright, guys, we're just waiting for Charlie to join up, then we'll get started. But like I said, there's quite a few people away due to the long weekend. They're having fun instead of studying, so keep that in mind. Bro, Charlie, bro, join the class. Hopefully this is the only time that we kind of have trouble with this, so should be good from next week on. Alright, we'll give him, like, a minute or 2. He's just having trouble, like, logging in and stuff. And then we'll get started. I think he's in. Charlie.
Yo.
Alright. Let's go. Zane, bro, where's your camera?
I need to turn it on, bro.
Alright. Yeah, well, thank you guys for coming into the class. I know obviously Sunday is not, you don't really want to be doing English study. That's fair enough, but fortunately, this is kind of the way to go, the way to improve. I think Thomas could definitely attest to that. And I think we're just going to start off with some introductions. So we'll introduce ourselves, and like I said, there's a few more people who are away, so they'll just watch the recording. They'll be in from next week, sort of onwards. And obviously, this class is like a Hagseed Tempest specialist class. So some of you guys are from different schools. Obviously, as we keep going, there'll be more people from different schools. That kind of helps us sort of collaborate together, with the same common goal of obviously doing really well internally as well as externally. So yeah, so in terms of help for the term as well, you've got myself. You all know who I am. Yeah, I guess that's kind of it. And then you also have Thomas. So Thomas, if you want to kind of give them a rundown who you are, what sort of qualifies you to tutor English, maybe a bit about what you're interested in, just a general introduction would be great.
Yep, sure. So, hi everyone. Those of you who are in Knox, you might have seen me before. If you don't know me, if you're not from Knox, I'm Thomas. I graduated from Knox last year. Last year, I scored the highest overall mark in English Advanced at Knox, and I was ranked 2 internally. So at least for the Knox boys, I know what the markers are looking for, and I'll guide you there. And also, if you're from other schools as well, I'll be able to help you with that as long as you give me some information. As for a little bit about me, I like tennis. I like playing piano, and this year I'm going to be going into medicine at UNSW. So pretty exciting stuff. Yeah. So obviously you've done your first assessment task, your task ones, what common module, whatever that is, and obviously now we're getting into the big leagues here. So module A. So obviously that's starting off with module A, and given that at least for the Knox boys, coming off from your module A assessment, your last module A assessment in year 11, hopefully this will be a little bit of familiar territory, but just with different texts. And obviously I'll be here to help you. So if you have any questions, or if you want me to mark anything, just send it to me in whatever platform that's required, and I'll be able to help you. As for module A, this was my favorite module at school, and this was my best module. I never lost a mark internally or externally for this module. So I do know how to make a variety of different markers happy. So I'll be here to help you, and hopefully we'll be able to increase your marks and get you some other things that your teachers might not be looking for, that your teachers might not be necessarily going through in the classroom with you over here.
Yeah, excellent. And just a bit of background into how Thomas is going to be supporting the class. So obviously I'll be teaching. Thomas will be able to answer questions. So he'll make some appearances. He has also designed the course. So as he said before, he literally never lost a mark for module A. And that's obviously across his internal, so the one assessment, then the internal trial, as well as the external HSC. So he really is an expert. He knows exactly what he's talking about. He's built the course. He'll be marking your homework, so that could range from, body paragraphs to, creative or whatever it is later down the line. So to have him in your corner, as well as me, I'd say is a pretty big sort of privilege. But what comes with that is we need you guys to kind of be, on it with the homework, especially. So we're going to give you a range of tasks, most of which I used and Thomas used to really improve, and do, pretty well in the HSC. So as long as you guys kind of put in the effort, we'll be in your corner. We'll be helping you out. You can ask questions in the circle. I know it's pretty difficult to navigate. It can be a bit frustrating, as we saw today. But as time passes, you guys will get quite familiar with that. We're also going to set up a Google Classroom for submissions for homework. That's each week, like a rolling thing. And all of the submissions that go in there will be marked by Thomas. So no matter what, you're really getting some, great input, and some really, really good support. He knows exactly what the mark is, especially at Knox. are looking for, and I'm sure that he'll be able to explain a little later, but like when we look at the rubric, but there are certain things that Knox prioritizes over other schools. And the same thing may apply to other schools. He's just really an expert at Knox, as well as obviously externally he did really well. So that's sort of an overview of what we're going to do and how we're going to run, and it's going to run for 12 weeks. Obviously there's going to be a bit more sort of emphasis around assessment time, so it's looking like week 8 or so. So we've got 9 weeks of runway to build a really, really good essay, to memorize that essay, and then closer to the assessment period we're going to have some classes where we're really focused on addressing the question. And again, as Thomas may be able to attest to probably in a little bit, that really is where a lot of the growth comes from. Being able to adapt your essay to questions is really what unlocks those top tier marks and what will help you improve. So that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to run. Thomas is really a great asset to have in your corner. Like, as I said, it's really good to have him. Obviously, for me, I've studied, graduated 2022, been doing tutoring for a while, and I know the ins and outs of how to get students to improve, obviously at law school as well. So articulation is a big thing that's emphasized there. And I guess even beyond just English, like I was saying to Samuel at the start of the lesson, Thomas is really across his sciences as well as his maths. So if you have any questions related to that, I'm sure he'd be able to help you there. And then also with sort of your uni stuff, him and I have both been through the what's it called? What's the uni platform called? Whatever it's called, I don't really remember. But we've been through the process. We know what it's like. We can provide guidance. I certainly can provide guidance as to selections of degrees. Doing commerce and law is pretty sort of broad. Thomas has the pathways into medicine if that's something that you're looking for. So we really like to think that we're an asset, a big asset in your guys' corner. But yeah, like I said, that's kind of enough from me. I kind of want to hear from you guys. You guys can introduce yourselves to each other. You're going to be working together, hopefully dominating together as well. Isn't that right, boys? Let's get some mics unmuted. What is this? Why is everyone laughing? What's happening?
Yep.
That was hard, bro.
That was hard. You feel hyped? You ready to dominate?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Right, we're gonna roll in. Bro, the English department's not gonna know what hit them. Facts. Is that facts, Flynn? Bro, unmute yourself, bro. Say something, bro.
Bro, you're embarrassing yourself.
Saying Chima, bro. Alright. Yeah, so that's enough from me. Let's start off with Samuel. Why don't you tell everyone a bit about yourself, a bit about what your goals are potentially? Kind of, we're going to be in class together every week, so it's probably good to know each other at least a little bit. So take it away.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm Samuel. I should say that. I go to Girwin High School. My goals, probably get like at least like above 18. But we should all aim for 20s. But yeah. I guess that's kind of it.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Samuel. Flynn, what's the go?
Well, I'm Flynn. I go to Knox. My goal for English is probably just to be like above like rank 30 by the end of the year.
And in terms of ranking, what does that look like as a potential mark? Is that looking like a band 6? What do you reckon?
That's probably like an 18 average.
Yeah, that is definitely a band 6 at Knox. All right, Zane.
I'm Zane. Go to Knox as well. And yes, a band 6 would be ideal.
Excellent. Charlie.
Yeah, I'm Charlie. I also go to Knox. I would also like a band 6. I like playing football. Yeah, that's kind of it.
All right, we've got the band 6 squad assembled. Like I said, you guys have got some pretty good support, so hopefully we'll get over the line. And I guess for today, to kind of move closer to that goal, obviously you guys are putting in the work over the long weekend, so big pat on the back for yourselves. We're going to start looking just generally, first at the rubric, really quick little dive into that. And then beyond that, we're going to look at the major themes that are covered in both the Tempest and Hagseed. So, yeah, let's get keen. Okay. So rubric, we've got a nice little emoji GIF thing. Interesting. All right, so in terms of what is covered in the rubric, I know with a lot of you I've kind of gone over it, but we're just gonna kind of zoom through it. In simple terms, essentially what you want to analyze is, what is included in the rubric as well as what's not included in the rubric. And what that really tells us is that choices in terms of the essay writing really comes down to context. So choices within your essay, as well as choices made by obviously Shakespeare and Margaret Atwood, are really influenced by their context. So, for example, some of the ideas that were covered in the Tempest, um, they really were important in Shakespeare's time, and some are still relevant today. But beyond that, Atwood really resonates with a lot of the stuff, and kind of brings it into the light of the 21st century zeitgeist. From the rubric, a lot of the things that we do get is a bit of meta language. Now, meta language is really, really important in terms of answering the question as well as aligning yourself with the rubric. That's what will really push you over the line. If you're using the language that's covered in the rubric, that starts to differentiate yourself from the rest of your peers. And I guess actually, just to quickly note, while we're discussing this stuff, like I'll ask you guys questions, but it is really like a uni lecture style. So I guess getting you guys ready for next year as well. I'm going to cover the content, and it's really up to you guys to take some notes. Obviously, these recordings will be posted, but the onus is for you guys to take notes. We'll share the slides and stuff, but the slides are really just designed for engagement purposes, is not so much content. So I guess it is kind of prepping for uni, in that it really forces you guys to make sure that you're, paying attention, taking notes, stuff like that. So yeah, like I said, the meta language, some key examples of that we have are reimagine, recharacterize, recontextualize, reshape, adapt, continue, extend, parallel, differ, diverge, and collide. So that's really what I wanted to cover from the rubric. Thomas, did you have anything to kind of add, any emphasis or anything?
Not too much. I mean, I think some teachers overemphasize the rubric, especially at Knox. I mean, like I remember from my first lesson in English in term one, like we spent like what 2 whole lessons on the rubric. I personally think that's a little bit retarded. You don't need to spend too much time on it. It's because apart from the common module, like the module A rubric's pretty simple. I mean, there's not too much. You just need to know why some things have changed and why some things are changed and why some things are similar. And it all just boils down to similarities and differences. You need both though, similarities and differences. I mean, differences, it's pretty obvious, but similarities is kind of the intellectual challenge. It's harder to do similarities sometimes, especially for things like gender, but doing those similarities is what other people won't say. So saying, because I think especially when you're going to externals, more particularly when there's a bunch of where there's a lot of people from different schools, you do want to say things that people won't say, not necessarily like different quotes, but different ideas. And I think that's one way that you can do that. But obviously we'll get more into that as we as we delve into more specific things. But in summary, the rubric's pretty simple. You don't need it's not as important as some teachers think it is, at least from my experience.
Yeah, and I think that the key thing to take from what Thomas just said was that point on differentiation. So the really important thing to stand out with your essay is to come with that blending of ideas between obviously what's similar and what's different. And if you can do that well, which we're going to try and gear you up for, you can really put yourself in a good, I guess, almost different basket from the rest of the cohort. And like I said, if you can do that well, they'll really position you to, hit those upper ranges, because that's kind of what it takes. You can't write a cookie cutter essay, even if it's really good, and expect to drop a 20. 20s are pretty rare, at least at Knox. They'd be rare at, every single school. I think normally you see at Knox, like 4 kids will get a 20, most normally. And if you read all those essays, they read very differently.
Yeah,
A
and
big thing to
yeah. Also, one thing is be aware that although a lot of people say like, oh, internals are harsher than HSC, a lot of my friends that was the case. I I mean, one of my friends got like 19s for both his module ASAs internally, but in the HSC ended up getting 16. And HSC was a general question as well. So just be aware of that.
Yeah.
It's not trying to scare you, but I mean, we'll help you along the way, but just don't get into that facade because HSC, it's harsher than you think it is.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, that's the rubric covered. As Thomas said, not much emphasis needed on that. I just really think that the similarities and differences, if you can discuss those well within your body paragraphs, then, like I said, you're kind of positioning yourself to do well. So we'll move now into a thematic overview. We've got a nice little photo here. Very funny. Do you think it's funny, Zane?
No.
Why not?
I don't know who made this, but they got to pack it up, bro.
Thomas, man. Thomas, do you have what are you going to say to that, Thomas?
It is what it is.
Bro, Zane, you hate him, bro. That's crazy.
Can we just get on with the content, bro? I'm not here to make jokes and laugh.
I think next week you're gonna have to create the PowerPoint.
Next week I'm not pulling up, bro.
This guy, bro. All right, let's see. Okay, so now we're looking at the theme of power. Like I said, we're going to cover a general overview of the themes that are present within the two texts, and the basis for this and sort of the rationale is that we're going to look very closely at these themes and these pairings in order to develop essay body paragraphs. So we're going to, like I said, generally cover them this week. And then from then on, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to do a deeper dive, which is going to be accompanied by evidence so that you guys can build up some body paragraphs. And then you can submit them, obviously, for marking. And in that way, you're prepared to answer. And Thomas, I've discussed with him sort of his approach. The more body paragraphs that you have in your back pocket, the better that you're sort of positioned to answer questions. Because at Knox, at least, and obviously it'd be the same with other schools, there can be very general questions, but then there can also be some quite specific questions, which entail a quote, for example, that focuses on a particular theme. So in order to prepare for that, we're going to get a bunch of bodies sort of written up, marked, ready to go. So you have them prepared probably before, if the test is looking like week 8, probably before week 6, so that everything's sort of ready to go. And then it just becomes answering the question on the day. So the first one we're going to look at, as sort of, the slide sets out, is we're going to look at the idea of power and leadership. So firstly, in relation to Shakespeare, and looking at the sources of authority specifically, we really have a big emphasis on divine order and this sort of divine hierarchy. So a bit of insight into what that means. Those individuals who are, let's say, in power or, have a form of political prowess are legitimized through an almost godlike selection. Right? So the people really believed that the individuals who are in power, so, kings, for example, dukes, whatever it is, they're elected essentially not by the people, by God himself. Right? So if we compare that, and this is, again, a difference that is emphasized in Hagseed, we look at the fact that authority comes from institutions, right? So in addition to these institutions, we also look at social power and personal influence. So that's sort of a direct contrast. There's less of a belief, because obviously it's a more secular society, there's less of a belief in the fact that the people in power are chosen by God, especially politically. And the emphasis is more so put on institutional power and social power, as opposed to individuals being selected by God. So beyond that, what we then look at is probably one of the most meaningful sort of issues to arise in, obviously, the Tempest and then in Hagseed, and we're looking at usurpation. So in the Tempest, we have almost a moral or spiritual rupture, right? There's a treason against the natural order. So Prospero is obviously usurped, and as a consequence of this, there is a big disruption, and this kind of leans back on this divine order idea, right? So you have this godlike figure, or not necessarily godlike, but selected by God figure, who power is taken away from. That's a very unnatural thing, right? At least at the time, it was believed to be a very unnatural thing. So if we consider that against in Hagseed, right, where it's more a bureaucratic betrayal, so it's more a political thing, we start to see that as opposed to the sort of defiance, power is represented more as like a game within set systems. So it's not this divine thing, it's more a systematized thing. Is that kind of making sense?
Yep.
Oh, all right, awesome. So they're kind of the two main things in relation to power. But then again, we have another sort of sub point, and this one's a bit more niche, looking at the idea of stepping away from leadership as not really a natural thing to do. So in the Tempest, there is almost a dereliction of like the sacred duty. So Prospero steps down from his role. So we have him obviously selected, following the divine order. He almost steps away from that in order to study. And as a consequence, there's this usurpation. And now what does this do? This creates a feeling of disorder within society, and it really just disrupts the natural order of things. This is a really big issue, right? And if we look to Hagseed, we see that the usurpation isn't necessarily taken the same, right? It's not represented in the same way, in that there isn't this big disruption of order. It's more so, I guess, in terms of what Felix experiences, the focus is more so on this idea of grief and obsession, right? And the consequence of those two emotions is this idea of psychological captivity, right? So the usurpation in both texts kind of brings about different emotions, right? Different consequences. And that really comes down to the idea or the fact that Atwood is writing in a secular society, a 21st century zeitgeist, right? Whereas Shakespeare is very secular, it's very Christian society. And Christianity at the time was more than just a religion, right? It was a moral compass for people. Yeah, they really believed in this stuff. So that's a bit more sort of, a bit of a different sort of perspective. The idea that if you step away from leadership, obviously it's not that, like it's not purported as big an issue potentially as usurpation, but just in stepping down, that represents almost a sin, right? In Shakespeare's time period. Whereas in Hagseed, the usurpation is a little bit different. So then finally, we'll look at the meaning of renunciation. So, restitution and obviously bringing things back to how they were. And sort of the emphasis there is that within the Tempest, there is a restoration of social and political order. And that really serves to affirm this idea of reconciliation. We're going to get into forgiveness in a little bit. That's another big theme. But I guess that brings it around full circle. So with Hagseed, there is a release of obsession as a consequence of both the usurpation and then obviously the loss of Miranda, so Felix's daughter. And again, we're going to get into that. That's a very big plot point that is differentiated from the Tempest. And that gives Atwood a big degree of dexterity. But with Hagseed specifically, the release of obsession allows Felix to regain an ethical self-control. So that's sort of the big picture in terms of the idea of, power and leadership. And I guess a bigger picture summary is the emphasis on divine right of kings, divine order. So that's a really big contextual point that in that body paragraph you'll need to emphasize. And then beyond that, we look at the consequences of usurpation. So again, regicide, considered a very big sin in the time period of Shakespeare. That's a big contextual point to look into. And then additionally, we have the idea, I guess the sub point of standing down from leadership. So in Shakespeare, Prospero takes a step back, that creates order. and a disorder, sorry, and we look at the consequence of that, and all of that is kind of transcribed into how Atwood presents these ideas. Does anybody have any questions? Does that all kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome. It's a really high level sort of analysis, and we're going to get more specific, like I said, in the following weeks with quotes, more detailed sort of emphasis on the context. But they're the big points: the divine order, um, the secularism experienced or present in Atwood's context, and how that really shapes the differences, particularly, but also the similarities. Thomas, did you have anything that you'd like to add in relation to that discussion?
No, not really. I mean, isn't really a theme that you'll do like an individual paragraph on per se, but aspects of this context you can definitely use it in your other paragraphs on different themes, which we'll get into later on.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I agree with him. As a standalone paragraph, it's not the best, but particularly in relation to that divine order, the difference between Shakespeare's society and Atwood's society, really, really big emphasis on context there. And like I said, as I've discussed with Thomas, sort of outside the lesson, particularly at Knox, the context is a really, really big emphasis. So they like the context a lot more maybe than the external markers do. So it's definitely something to keep in mind when preparing and drafting. And for you, Samuel, it's probably pretty similar at your school. The big emphasis on context. All right, let's keep rolling. So we've just got a little bit there. If you just want to have a quick read of the slides. And I'll send you guys the slide deck as well, and the accompanying notes after the session. So now I've got another cool GIF, but we're going to really hone in on this idea of magic and the supernatural. And that's a particularly big point, maybe not necessarily as something that is a standalone paragraph, pretty similar to the power and leadership, but something that informs the plot of the play particularly, as well as the context, because it's pretty interesting that in Shakespeare's time people believed in magic. So that's kind of something to think about when you're reading as well. It's not like this is a very fanciful, so out of the realm of reality sort of story. People genuinely believe that this was a possibility in that time period. So let's take a look. So again, we'll take a similar approach. So looking at similarities and differences, because that is really the emphasis of the course between Shakespeare and Atwood. So with Shakespeare, he has obviously a Jacobean worldview. So what that kind of brings about is this idea that magic is a credible source of power within the culture. So like I said, surprisingly, people sort of believed in things like astrology, occultism, witchcraft, providence. These things are, pretty interesting. You wouldn't find many people around nowadays who thought that, spells and magic and stuff was, a real thing. But in this time period, people did, right? And so that's a pretty significant contextual point. Again, the emphasis is on the context. It's a very significant contextual point, especially when we compare across to Atwood. Because like I said, I don't think anyone believes in magic. Do any of you believe in magic? Someone respond, bro.
Zane does.
All right, mate.
Zane. You doing
No, I
card
don't,
tricks or something? What's going on?
No, I'm a very sane person. I think Charlie's a bit slow in the head, though.
All right, excellent. So you got one magic believer. Okay, so Zane, you'll be able to relate to this stuff. Beyond obviously just what I said about magic, people believed in the supernatural, right? And that was extended beyond this idea of random fantasy, and aligned with sort of the anxieties and intellectual currents of the time period. People were concerned about things that were supernatural, and again, tying back to the astrology, stuff like that. It's very, very interesting, very significant contextual difference in terms of social context between the texts. And then we consider, in comparison, Atwood's 21st century worldview. So instead of magic being, you know, this thing where you cast a spell on someone and they're cooked, right? Magic is represented differently. So magic in Atwood's context is represented as theatre and technology, right? So that's the translation between magic in Shakespeare's time period and magic in Atwood's time period. Now, I know that sounds like a load of, you know, BS, but this is kind of what the market's potentially like, right? And the way that sort of, you know, the magic flows or translates between the text, and this is obviously a secular translation, the way that it does that is Atwood modernizes, the magic into stagecraft and media. And what that means is obviously through the stagecraft and media, Atwood is able to control sort of what happens in a similar way to what Prospero does. Right, so Prospero obviously utilizes magic to sort of place things in different ways, to see different things play out. Atwood is able to replicate that using stagecraft, theatre, technology, right? So that's a particular, again, I know that I'm saying this a lot, but this is a particularly important point. It's a particularly important distinction between the two texts. And the markers, particularly again, they love this theatre talk, this meta theatre talk, right? It's hard to pull off, but if you can pull off a discussion of meta theatre, it starts to place you in that basket of differentiation because a lot of students will stay away from it. Right? We've got some themes that we're going to look at that are a bit simpler to sort of think about, like with gender and colonization, for example. They're pretty straightforward, although there's a bit of nuance that Thomas has shared, obviously, in his planning. But that's more of a difficult thing to grasp. And we're going to really dive deep in a future lesson into what that means and how you actually have an effective body paragraph on that. Because again, like I'm saying, that's a big differentiator. I can guarantee after, 3-4 weeks in class, you go around, ask your class, like each student, what does meta theatre mean? Or they don't know what it means. I said they're obviously not going to write a body paragraph on it. And the teachers understand this. They've read these essays for years and years. The rubric's been the same for like 8 years. They know if a student, like if a question brings up meta theatre and the student's not writing about meta theatre, it's because they don't understand it. And realistically, do you think they're going to reward someone who hasn't done the work to understand what meta theatre is, even though it's a very sort of prolific point in the play and also in Atwood's piece? Probably not, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And I guess sort of a way to kind of summarize the distinction between the two texts is that Shakespeare presents magic as this culturally credible force. Right, so like I said, society actually believed in it, whatever. And then Atwood takes that and retools the magic into theatrical illusion to keep its effect meaningful for modern audiences. She didn't want to just cast away the idea of magic. She wanted to replicate it in a believable way. Right, she wanted to translate the magic and chuck it into a 21st century audience and make it, like if you're reading about magic and spells in 2021, you're either 2026, sorry, you're either like 10 or maybe you are like retarded. So no offense to anyone if they read that stuff, but it's not really applicable. Okay, so now we're looking, I guess, more particularly at we're going to emphasize this sort of Tempest outlook. I went forward too much. Another cool GIF. You guys get like a sneaky preview of the next GIF. Let me go back. Where are we at? Sorry. Yeah, so we're going to look deeper into sort of the Tempest. So sort of a contextual claim within the time period was that Jacobean audiences were primed to accept supernatural influence, that actually believed in it, and consequently, there was this fear and fascination with, for example, witchcraft or occult knowledge, right? And as a result of all of that, the supernatural functions as a serious category of power. It's a real thing. Yeah, I just want to make that clear. And then directly linking to the characterization that we see within the Tempest, we have Prospero as a magus, so spelled M-A-G-U-S, because he's a dude. knowledge becomes sort of this mastery of magic. So Prospero obviously sort of elects to give up or steps away from his role in leadership, as we discussed previously. And he does that in order to study. What he's studying is this idea of magic, right? So in the text, he's more than just like a random wizard. Yeah, he didn't spawn in with all these like capabilities to like orchestrate all this stuff, right? He learned how to do that through magic, right? He's a learned, he's almost like a learned controller of this hidden knowledge, and the audience becomes very fascinated in that, right? And so what he does with that knowledge is he converts that knowledge into command over the island, aerial, and sort of everything that takes place on the island. So that's a bit of sort of plot integration. And then finally, we come to this book, right? And the book, the spell book, is a very, very central symbol or prop within the text because of what it represents. So it functions as a source or system of Prospero's power. So all of his knowledge is stored in this book, right? And what that results in is his ability to orchestrate the outcomes of what happens on the island. He knows what's going to happen, right? And this is all derived from his spell book. As a consequence of his ability to orchestrate these outcomes, he gains dominance over others' agency. So this book, again, as a symbol, as a prop, as a metaphor, really functions as the technology of power within Shakespeare's universe. It's not some far-fetched thing. It's a thing that realistically, to these people, could have been a source of power. So now if we look more particularly at Hagseed, we've got, like I said earlier, a more modern audience. They're more secular, more rational, more institutional. Belief in sort of what is ocular is marginal, so they don't really believe in the supernatural. It doesn't carry the same cultural seriousness, right? But beyond that, the modern equivalent, as I discussed previously, is this idea of theatrical magic. Yeah, and I really want to make sure that everyone gets it. So is everyone kind of on the same page with that theatrical magic idea? Like everyone nodding
What do you
heads?
mean by theatrical magic? Is it like special effects, sound effects,
Yeah,
video effects?
exactly. It's like a bit silly, right? But in Atwood's sort of realm, she understands that like you, me, like we're not going to believe that magic is real, right?
Says who?
Whereas, huh?
Says who, bro?
Oh, actually, oh yeah. Well, Charlie said you do, so
Yeah.
everyone else in the call doesn't believe magic is real. So I guess that's like she wants to address us.
Yeah, right.
Um,
The weirdos.
yeah, the weirdos, yeah, the ones that don't believe in magic. So what she means, or what I mean, sorry, by the translation into sort of theatrical magic is really the idea that reality can be crafted through theater. Yeah. So in a play, you write a script, you write a plot, right? So that in the same way is very similar to what Prospero is doing on the island, except Prospero is controlling everything through magic. What Atwood does is positions everything to be controlled through theater. Does that kind of make sense, Zane?
Why me?
Because you asked the question.
Oh, well, yeah, but I can read the dot points too, bro.
Bro, I'm gonna pull up. Bro, I'm actually just pull up to your locker, bro.
All right.
I know where you're at. I'll ask, bro. Miss Cal likes me. I'll ask. Oh, I just want to speak to Zane.
Miss
Where's
Cal's
Cal?
irrelevant, bro.
Is she? I thought she held some power, bro.
No, she's a nobody now. I'm
I
above
got Mr. James's number on speed dial, bro. I'll call him. I'll
her.
find where
You're
you're
a nobody, bro. Who are you?
at. No, I actually have his number.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I do. Be
All
careful.
right, but yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, excellent. And then I guess kind of beyond that, we have Felix. So he is representative of Prospero within the text. And I guess kind of piggybacking onto what I was saying earlier about how theatre controls or translates from the magic scene in The Tempest, Felix becomes a modern Prospero, and what he does is he leverages like the scripting of reality. So who speaks, when they speak, what they say, what is revealed, and through that he can engineer outcomes. So, for example, revenge is plotted. So he plots this revenge through performance. And what he's really doing is controlling people's perception. And again, this is a key sort of difference. He's controlling people's perception rather than nature, which is what is done through magic. So that's the key distinction. Okay. Does anybody have any more questions about that?
Yeah, what do you mean by like controlling perception rather than like their nature, like the actual physical? I don't get it.
So it's not so much their nature, it's nature more generally, right? So if we look at the Tempest, for example, like they're on an island,
Hmm.
and Prospero is able to command these natural events,
Hmm.
right? So that's more what I mean by nature. In terms of
Okay.
what I mean by perception, right? In the performance, people are seeing what is happening.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not so much because, and it relates to that idea of the difference in context between who believes in magic and who doesn't believe in magic. So in the Tempest, you're able to use magic to, for example, have a tempest happen, like
Hmm.
a storm. Whereas in Hagseed, like that's not, no one's going to buy that.
Yeah.
So what she leverages is this idea of changing people's perception of things. So if
Okay.
you
Right.
see something, you believe it, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, and Felix uses that to control and almost act out his plot for revenge.
Hmm.
Yeah. Thomas, anything to add on that point?
No, not really, but do know the difference between magic and meta theater. They're a bit distinct in a few ways, but they're fundamentally the same ideas. And as alluded to before, meta theater is a good paragraph to have because not many people are going to do it, and it shows that you're smart. I mean, meta theater was one of my main paragraphs in my main essay, and that kind of carried me as well.
And I guess to kind of break up the lesson a bit, if you could just talk a bit about like how you kind of structured your essay, just to give a bit of, I guess reality to the utility of these different paragraphs. Like how did you approach, for example, let's say your trial for module A in order to make sure that you didn't lose any marks?
It's not. I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, if you have your like evidence properly, and if you have proper evidence and you support it adequately, you should be able to get the marks. I mean, obviously, all three assessments I did. So that was my task two, trials and HSC. They were all general questions, but I guess it does come down to a lot of practice, which kind of gets you to be more comfortable integrating like unseen terms of a question before. But I mean, as long as if but then phrasing is not the most important thing. The more important thing is to have solid ideas.
Mm, mm. And then I guess sort of tying into the idea of having solid ideas and, preparing and, like you said, just being prepared to answer questions, what can these guys sort of expect moving forward in order to kind of achieve that level of preparation similar to what you did? What are we kind of looking at doing, do you
I mean,
think?
obviously we're going to cover like one theme every week, so like no one theme every 2 weeks. So for example, we might do like revenge forgiveness on Tempest. So like, generally try to write like one paragraph every week. That shouldn't be too bad, especially when it's like a dormant assessment period. So you'll pretty much just write one paragraph a week and then just get it marked by me. And then obviously when you are come assessment time, in case they throw you a dirty quote, you'll be ready. Because I know, especially for module A, it's probably a lot very volatile. Like everyone just had their two main themes and they had nothing else. So everyone in like trials and HSC were really really scared. It's like, oh, what happens if there's like a gender quote? We're all screwed. So just having that under your wheelhouse is a good idea. Although be advised for task two, Knox is like very very consistent. So task two will very likely be a general question. So then you can just use your main themes. But then just having all those other stuff pre-prepared is good, just in case they decide to change something up. and so you don't have to stress in trials writing up a lot of new paragraphs. So just getting everything done early is the best way to go.
Yeah, and I guess just sort of last sort of follow up in relation to that distinction between what is a general question and what's a more specific question. If you could kind of step the guys through what that looks like, what is the actual difference, because that can be, you know, a bit sort of unclear if you haven't lived through module A. If you could do that, that'd be great as well.
Yeah. So obviously, I mean, you might have got. I think from memory, someone told me that you got a quote from Yates. So that's the Knox boys. So with that, they can give you a quote from either the Tempest or Hagseed, but it'll be kind of like narrow, so it'll be more or less targeted to a specific theme. But if it's just a general question, then it'll just be kind of like what you had in your new boy assessment, I believe, which was like a general question that can either just be the question itself, so like how does da 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 da, or it can be like a quote, like from maybe like a quote from a newspaper or a quote from a critic that's like about like how texts are reimagined, like a very general quote. But then with those general sorts of questions, you can choose your theme. So then you can just go with your mains and just adapt them to the question. There's much less limitation there. But generally for task 2, it will always be a general question as far as I'm aware. I'm pretty sure that's what it's been for the last 5 years, and I don't anticipate that they're going to change it unless they decide, unless the English department is sad that the band 6 rate for our year almost halved.
Yeah, and I know, speaking from experience as well, like for my internal, it was a general question. So obviously prepping now for the specific themes is useful, not only to just be more prepared for this upcoming assessment, to ease that anxiety, because like Thomas was saying, people were saying, you know, oh, I'm cooked if there's a question about this. And you guys have all done English assessments, you know how that feels. That's only going to negatively impact your performance. If you're going into the exam thinking, oh, if they ask this, I'm cooked, like you're not going to be able to think as clearly as if you thought, okay, no matter what they ask, I'm chilling. All I have to do now is just perform. Right? It's a very different position to be in. It's a position of leverage, and it's a position that I want all of you guys to be in. As long as you just do the work along the way, it will guide you. But yeah, thanks for that, Thomas. It's
Yeah, and in saying that, you don't need to memorize your spare ones verbatim. Just memorize your main ones like more or less word for word, and then just have like really solid ideas. I mean, know your quotes obviously, but the analysis for your backups, so to speak, you should be able to. You can probably just make that up on the spot, or obviously you'll have your pre-written paragraphs, but as long as you've got your ideas solid, that should be good enough.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let's keep it pushing. You guys have seen this GIF, so run it back again. We're looking at the theme of revenge and forgiveness. So this is a particularly important one. So now we're shifting from the more contextually based or utility based in context paragraphs to having something that you could genuinely deploy on the day of your exam, right? And what that looks like is this idea of revenge and forgiveness within both the Tempest and Hagseed. So one of the particular points that is pretty important with this is the distinction between the outcomes between the two texts. So if we look at Shakespeare first, obviously we're looking at the 17th century, and we're focalizing on this idea of Christian paradigm. So that's sort of the implications of that is that forgiveness is this central virtue, right? And in sort of dichotomizing, the idea of revenge brings about risks of moral disorder. So on the one hand, you have forgiveness that's really championed by the Christian paradigm. On the other, you have the idea of revenge that can bring about a moral disorder within the self, right? And this is all sort of believed in the time period, really dominant guiding Christian paradigm. People really believe this stuff. It was almost like a Reformation era worldview. So God was touted as supreme, with mercy and forgiveness coming as culturally authoritative emotions and actions, right? So a good resolution in that sort of same vein would look like reconciliation and mercy, right? So if we look at Atwood comparatively, we're talking in a more secular paradigm. I know I've said that time and time again, but this is something that's, you need to address this in the essay. It is the biggest distinction between the two texts in terms of when they're writing. And like Thomas has said, like I've said, context is a really big part. You need to be across this, right? So what we look at in comparison is this idea of revenge functioning as a release as opposed to this moral disorder sort of inducing action, right? So through revenge, you can achieve a psychological limit, like liberation, right? So what Atwood is doing is not writing to affirm Christianity. Instead, she considers these modern frameworks of, let's say, I don't know, trauma, grief, therapy, even things like obsession and rumination, which we really see with Felix. So it's very, very different in terms of how revenge is posited between the texts. And again, linking to the context, the difference is the secularist society versus the really Christian-led society. That's the big emphasis. So if we look deeper into the Tempest, what we have is that Prospero begins in almost a revenge posture, right? He's in control and he's seeking retribution. So he engineers suffering and fear through obviously what I talked about earlier with the magic, and he orchestrates a range of various trials, right? This revenge is not random. He's seeking this. It's structured, right? It's almost like comes across as like a moral theater in order to confront the wrongdoing of the people who have kind of, gone against him, right? Beyond that, we look at sort of the turning point within the text. So we start off with revenge being, this really big thing. Obviously, this directly sort of juxtaposes what is championed by the Christian society. But we start to see that Christian sort of paradigm permeate the text with the term mercy becoming an engine for resolution, right? So there's a movement away from revenge towards forgiveness. And forgiveness ultimately becomes what drives the final reconciliation and restoration for the characters, right? So the play, obviously, it revolves not through revenge being completed. It starts off with revenge, but through the selection of mercy. That's where the virtue comes. So obviously, if you think about that, that's what Shakespeare's talking to. He's talking to the modern, or not the modern, sorry, he's talking to his audience to emphasize the Christian paradigm of mercy, right? And ultimately, this is kind of a good word to use. Catharsis is achieved through this renunciation, through the abandonment of revenge, and through seeking peace. Right? Prospero ultimately gains catharsis. He gets to rest, right, through relinquishing the revenge and coercive sort of control that he was seeking previously. Yeah? And we see in the final act, there's a calmer, more restorative tone. So that's really deep dive into sort of, or not really deep dive, but that's sort of a deeper dive into how the Tempest sort of brings in this idea of revenge and mercy. And you see that the start is quite dichotomous with the end, right? And that's a very interesting and really important sort of plot arc that you're going to look into and potentially divulge within your essay on the day of your exam in whatever, 9 weeks or so.
Why is that interesting?
Do you not think it's interesting, Zane?
No, but isn't that kind of obvious? That he
What do you mean?
he changes from revenge and anger and whatever to forgiveness.
But I think it's more so the utility of, Shakespeare emphasizing that to audiences and why that comes about within the Christian society. And then it's also particularly important when we look at the difference between Hagseed. So the
Because it's
idea
not
of
as Christian. So it's
Pardon?
because Atwood's society or context is secular. So that's why it's different. Is that what you're saying?
Precisely, right?
Oh, perfect.
It's not like they don't come from the same sort of Christian morality in this society. And so Hagseed and Atwood doesn't just say that revenge is like, it's not that bad. She actually almost encourages revenge as a method of escaping like a psychotic sort of prison.
Yeah, right.
It's very interesting to see the difference between obviously the Christian sort of paradigms of Shakespeare's time to contrast it with the secularist paradigms that permeate Atwood's text. We're going to get into, like right now, we're going to look at what the implications of that in Hagseed are. And this is really just to show like it's like similar, right? Because they're looking at the same ideas. Yeah, and this is what Thomas was talking about earlier and I was talking about with the rubric in terms of similarities and differences. They're both contending with the same idea of revenge. They both have their reason for revenge. Prospero obviously usurped. He's pretty pissed. Felix, similar sort of thing. His daughter is also like dead. Like it's, they're both seeking revenge. But Atwood changes the way that is reflected in her text. Yeah, and changes sort of the narrative around revenge to match her society. If you can step through that in a paragraph, like you're genuinely set to do pretty well. And I know, Zane, you said it's pretty simple. It is pretty simple. Right? I know in my discussions with Thomas, he said that this is the most straightforward sort of module. Yeah, but only if you have sort of the correct guidance and you can think about it in the correct way. Right, so that's kind of where we're at. So let's look at sort of the Hagseed, sorry. All right. So we have Felix, who kind of starts off in this psychic debt, right? So obviously his daughter is dead, but then he's also betrayed. So Felix experiences like an ousting, deep personal injury. Yeah. And so what he does in response to that is consider revenge as a mechanism to almost balance the ledger. And when I say balance the ledger, like to get even essentially, right? So the way that Atwood frames revenge is almost like a debt story, very similar to the sort of, what's the word? I can't think of the specific word, but it's like an eye for an eye sort of thing. Felix has lost his eye, so now he's seeking someone else's, right? Something is owed to him and he wants repayment, right? Beyond that, he follows through. So that's a clear distinction from what we see in Shakespeare's text, right? Felix follows through on his revenge plot. This produces closure and there's no mercy achieved, right? So unlike Prospero's ultimate restraint, which Shakespeare champions, Felix completes the revenge plot, right? And in sort of a different light to what is shown in Shakespeare's text, the catharsis is tied instead in Hagseed to the execution and completion of a revenge plot, right? In essence, Atwood inverts Shakespeare's ethics. Yeah? The release arrives through a follow-through of the plan. And then I guess what we end up with is that following the execution of this plan, following the enactment of revenge, the grief that Felix feels can finally be let go. And that particularly pertains to the discussion and sort of the issues that arise with considering Miranda as a character. And that is particularly important because obviously in The Tempest, Miranda is, alive, right? She's in the thing. Miranda in Hagseed is not, right? And again, that's a very key difference. And it really pertains to the discussion of emotions like trauma, grief. These are all very modern things. You don't see that in The Tempest, but you see that in the new text. That's particularly important to address. It's very different, right? And I guess tying back to what we see with Felix, we have this revenge, an obsession. He satisfies this, and now he has this emotional release. He's released from this fixation, right? Letting go in Atwood's text is not framed as a Christian mercy. It's almost like a psychological recovery, and that ties back to the debt thing that I was talking about, the eye for an eye thing. And as you guys can definitely appreciate, that is completely different to what is championed in The Tempest. Is that kind of all making sense to you guys? Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Let's go, Zane. Bro, you're going to cook, bro. Next assessment, cooking. Thomas, what do you have? Do you have any sort of different insights, anything that you think I kind of missed or any emphasis points from that?
Nope, that pretty much says it all.
I'm on fire today, guys. You're so silent. It's like, bro, like I'm trying, guys. I'm trying to make it interesting. Charlie, am I doing a good job?
You need some more gifts, that's why.
Bro, Thomas, where are the gifts at? They like the gifts. You need to put more in the slides next week.
Yeah, maybe might have to ask DB for a few as well.
Yeah. Get some input. Zane, can you help out as well, bro?
No, I'm good, bro. Count me out.
Okay. Let's move to the second last. Oh, there you go. There's a GIF. I don't know about that one, Thomas. That one's kind of okay. I don't know about that one. Let's get that off the screen. Okay. So now we're looking at gender, as you just saw. Second last theme. So you guys are almost there. Like I said, this class is really a thematic overview. For some of you guys who haven't read the text, it kind of fills your knowledge on what is happening. And like I said, I'm going to share the notes that we have. You'll have the slides. And it kind of, like I said, bridges the gap between if you haven't read the text in its entirety, which hopefully you have, you've got like 4 days until school starts again. So if you haven't, not looking at anyone in particular, Flynn, you should read the text. Do you agree, Thomas? Do you think that everyone should read the text?
Yeah, probably. Might be a good idea.
Probably a good idea, guys. Flynn, read the text, bro. All right. Let's look at gender. So when we consider this idea of gender within the two texts, as I said, it's a more straightforward, straight shooting theme. A lot of students will take this. And, in my sort of experience at Knox, I know internally I scored pretty well. I think I got 19 in both instances, using gender as one of my paragraphs. But I think particularly if you are going to use gender, you need a broader through line. So if you're going to talk about gender and you're just going to talk about gender, you're going to get cooked because every single kid will talk about gender probably, realistically, right? It's the simplest to grasp. So in order to sort of stand out and succeed, especially internally at Knox, you need to have a differentiator. So let's consider what it's all about, taking the same approach that we've taken, similarities and differences. First, we're going to look at the concept as a whole. So with Shakespeare, we're stepping away from the secularist society focus and we're looking more at the patriarchal 17th century context. So thinking of the implications of that, we had women's agency being constrained by paternal authority as well as social hierarchy. So if we look particularly at Miranda, her role and her value is shaped by obedience, chastity norms, and I guess kind of like marriage politics, right? Shakespeare mixes, however, and this is kind of an important note, he mixes compliance with this general sort of assumption and these themes with moments of authority through Miranda, sorry. And this is quite a progressive stance, but we'll delve a bit deeper into that in a sec. Comparatively, we've got Margaret Atwood, right? She's writing in a 21st century, second wave feminist context. Yeah? Here, the script is completely flipped. We've got gender looking through the idea of empowerment. We've got performance, and really, what we see is a critique of male control. Yeah, she's essentially hating on the boys being in control of stuff, and saying, girls can do the same. So that's really the big difference, and that comes from the fact that it is a second wave feminist society. And so what that looks like through the text is Miranda being reimagined through a split. Right? So there's this passive memory of Felix's daughter, but then there's an active female presence within the play that's constructed in the prison, right? So what modern audiences sort of expect is this idea of female agency to be expressed in the text. And what Atwood does is really puts that into motion. So I guess a more high level sort of summary, if we were to bring those two concepts with Shakespeare and then Atwood together, Shakespeare more so stages gender within patriarchal structures, but gives Miranda flashes of agency, right? Obviously, we'll delve deeper into what those flashes are in the session on gender, but that's sort of the high level way to think about it, right? And then we have in contrast Atwood, who really amplifies this idea of female power and explicitly critiques, like I said before, this idea of male control, right? She's not having it, yeah? And still, in doing that, she's able to expose how women can be positioned, and this really relates to the critique, as objects, within male narratives. Right, so that's more of a high level sort of structure. That's a high level way of thinking about the two sort of texts and how they interact with each other in terms of the ideas. So now looking a bit deeper into the Tempest, sort of breaking it down, we'll look more specifically at Miranda. So we have her initially posited as obedient to Prospero, as sheltered, instructed, controlled with really limited autonomy, right? And this, again, as I said just previously, is aligned with this idea of the archetype of the virtuous daughter, particularly in this patriarchal order, right? So she is exactly what people want, or, for example, paternal figures want in their daughters. Yeah, and that permeates the whole of the text and, is a really big sort of emphasis in Miranda's characterization, right? But what we see then, and this is the progressive part with Shakespeare, we have this evidence for agency. And I guess, like, in a way, and this is pretty interesting to consider, she's posited as almost like a feisty sort of character or feisty autonomy, right? So Shakespeare complicates the passive reading of Miranda in that she's this virtuous daughter with instances where she, for example, challenges Prospero morally. Right? So we look at, for example, the distinction between empathy and suffering, or where she pushes against instructions regarding Ferdinand, right? Or acts with initiative on her own sort of whims, or displays wonder, confidence. All of these ideas are in direct conflict with the patriarchal paradigms that are seen, I guess, within the social context of Shakespeare. And then finally, we kind of, come to this idea that Miranda shows some agency, but what it does is it really just operates within the system set to her by Prospero. He's ultimately still in control. He controls what happens. He has the knowledge, and he's still in charge. Shakespeare doesn't deviate that much, but he does deviate somewhat from what is expected in society. And in terms of, having a bit of nuance in the paragraph, that's where the nuance comes from. Being able to explicitly kind of elucidate that within your paragraph, right? And then we look more specifically at Hagseed. So like I said previously, we've got this sort of, second wave feminist idea. But the key here is really this idea of a doubled Miranda, right? So you have the ghost of Miranda. So it's a memory, almost an object, silent, and it's really tied into Felix's grief. But then we have the character in the text, Anne-Marie, right? So she doubles as Miranda, but then almost an aerial function as well. So she's living, she's skilled, she's very assertive, physically powerful in her sort of capacity as an acrobat, which you will see in the text, and that's sort of the characterization point. And she's very competent and confident, right? So if we think about sort of the distinction with Miranda in The Tempest, it's different, but it's not that different, right? It's different, but it's not that different. And if we kind of build onto that, there's really this key contrast. So in the Tempest, or in Hagseed, Atwood doesn't allow Felix or Prospero to control Anne-Marie or Miranda in the same way that we see Prospero control Miranda in The Tempest, right? Atwood gives Anne-Marie a high degree of autonomy, a high degree of dexterity, and really limits the masculine authority that Felix has, right? Anne-Marie resists, negotiates, asserts boundaries, for example. And that's not something that we see in the older texts. That's a key distinction, right? And then if we think about this in the feminist milieu, so obviously 21st century, agency is really, and again, this kind of relates to the idea of magic, right? Agency is a modern plausibility. And people think that this is a real thing, which it is. Yeah. In Shakespeare's time period, it would have been just as fanciful as us or Atwood writing about magic. Right? He was progressive, but he was within limits. Yeah. Because modern audiences understand that agency for females is a big plausibility and a reality, in fact, Atwood is able to really transcend the confines of what Shakespeare works with. Yeah. So that's a really, really, really big distinction. It's the exact same sort of concept as with the magic. People don't believe in magic, so Atwood's not going to talk about it. People didn't believe in female agency, so Shakespeare didn't talk about it to the extent that he could have. Right? That's the key distinction that I want you guys to kind of understand. All right. And so again, reflecting that in Atwood's choices, she really expects women to be active participants in society, beyond just symbolic sort of, I guess, prizes, I guess, kind of how you say it, which you see in Shakespeare. The values for women go beyond chastity and obedience to competence, autonomy and assertiveness. And then there is and we see it through the Anne-Marie Felix, not dichotomy, Felix, sort of like, what's the word? Like you see it between their relationship that there isn't this paternalistic language and control, which you see in the Tempest. Yeah, that's sort of the key thing that I want to get across with the gender. And again, we're going to delve really deep into this paragraph because it's a very common paragraph. It's a pretty simple paragraph to understand. And like I said, speaking from experience, you can do really well talking about it. So that's kind of it in terms of the gender. Does anybody have any questions about gender? You all kind of get it? All right, we're going to quickly fly through this race and othering. And this, again, is a really big sort of paragraph. I use this, so my pairing in, internally and externally. I don't know what I got externally, but it was pretty solid. I didn't buy back my paper or anything. Is like I used the race and then gender, and then the way that I framed it was like a psychological sort of imprisonment through social constructs. So I guess that's a bit of insight and, really relating what we're learning now to what you're literally going to write about in the exam. And I guess it bridges the gap between, obviously it's January, so you're thinking, oh, I'm chilling, I've got ages, but like you're going to be writing about this stuff in the exam. So it's pretty important to kind of get it, at least if not now, but when we do the deep dives. So quickly fly through this because we're running out of time. In terms of othering and colonization, like I said, it's a pretty prolific sort of issue that's contended with in both texts. And if we're looking at the context, we're really looking, and again, you'll notice the distinction in the contextual focus when you change themes. So we've gone from secular to patriarchal to now we're looking at the colonial context, with, for example, the era of discovery, right? So when we consider the idea of othering, I know for the Knox boys, you would have looked at Othello, and that's a pretty similar concept. So we've got othering entangled with early colonial ideology. So obviously, like I said, the era of discovery, people viewed natives as inherently inferior. We're going to see how Shakespeare kind of contends with that in a second. But we had the New World, and essentially that context normalizes binaries, so the direct dichotomization of things. So an example of that would be the dichotomy between civilized and savage. You were either civilized, or if you were conquered, you were savage, right? And we see, particularly with Caliban in the text, that there is this other dichotomy of human and thing, or human and monster, right? And they're pretty important to sort of attack. But beyond that, and speaking on Caliban, we have this character who becomes, really the focal point to explore this colonial anxiety and ideology. Sorry, right? So he almost becomes like a performance himself for the study of colonialism. So we see how he interacts, for example, with the characters and what we get from them. Whereas when we consider Atwood, and again, you can appreciate it's a different contextual sort of emphasis, we've got a really multicultural society that we're focusing on. It's a modern society, so we're looking at modernity and the consequential, like I said, multiculturalism that comes with that. So we've got this idea of othering as opposed to being based on these binary dichotomies, as shown through representation and voice and social reform. Right? So it's not the same. It's not just race that dictates the othering of individuals. Right? And what the big focus of that in Atwood's text is the prison setting. Right? We're looking at institutional marginalization between race and class. So it's very, very different. Yeah. Instead of looking at race now, it's a less contentious issue. It's very sort of multicultural. We're looking at class distinction. Yeah. And we look at that through jail, right? Prisoners. I don't want to hang out with any prisoners personally, right? And that's sort of the thing that Atwood challenges. She tries to humanize them. She tries to show that maybe they're not that bad. Yeah, so that's sort of the big difference there. But in addition to that, we look at Caliban, and there's sort of a critique in relation to that with the humanization. And then particularly a good plot point is the growth of these prisoners through art. And that's kind of something that we'll touch on again, like I said, in a further lesson when we really look at othering. But that's, yeah, like I said, that's a pretty important point. We'll quickly fly through a little bit of a deeper dive. But essentially, when we look at the Tempest, we've got Caliban fulfilling that colonial stereotype of othering. The evidence for that is really found in the dehumanization of him. So we have language that frames him as, for example, subhuman. I think a pretty good quote that I can remember, or maybe not pretty good. We'll look at the utility of it later, but like a thing of darkness is how he's characterized. And as a consequence of that, he's associated with violence, the idea of like sexually threatening. And this really, like I said, mirrors the colonial discourse of savages, right? Thinking about that binary between human and savage. And what that is used for in the context of, the era of discovery is to justify the conquest and enslavement of these savages. So Shakespeare's really looking at that. I think actually we'll delve into this at the start of next session. There's quite a bit of, I guess, nuance in the general sort of way that it works. But does anybody have any questions about anything that we've kind of gone through today? No questions, Flynn?
I think Zane had some.
Zane, you got a question, mate?
Charlie was texting me about his questions, but I couldn't answer them, so they can go to you.
All right, Charlie, what's your question, bro?
No, Zane was just unsure who Prospero was, so I had to answer it for him.
Why are you lying, bro? No, that's crazy.
All right.
Bro, Charlie didn't know who Miranda was. Charlie didn't know what gender meant, bro. It's kind of crazy.
Boys. Very good participation today, both of you. Zane and Charlie, gold stars. There's going to be some homework sent out to you guys. Make sure you've read the text as well, please. It's pretty important to understand, as Thomas said. Send out some homework, get it done. You guys were all very good today, so good stuff. And next week we're going to delve deeper into some of the themes and, start writing. But thank you very much for your attendance today. We'll get cracking earlier next session. And like I said, because it's a long weekend, there's quite a few people away. But we're going to look to get a few more faces in here that'll be joining from next week. So the recording's going to be published. If you think anything was particularly useful, you can obviously go back and find that. But yeah, until next week, enjoy your week, do your homework. You got a couple more days of holidays, so enjoy it. And then you're back into the year 12 sort of grind. And feel free, obviously, to message in the chat. You guys are all in it now, so you can send messages if you have questions. Either Thomas or I will get to them. But the most important thing is the homework. Like, we really need that done because we want you guys to do well. And we're kind of giving you everything that you need to do well, so there's no excuse. All right, boys. thank you for pulling up. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Enjoy your public holiday tomorrow. And yeah, see you later.
Take
Thanks,
care,
Riley.
boys.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas.
All good.
Thank you.
See ya.